Hello, my name is Amy Wheeler, and I am here with Matt Erb and Steve Haynes. Steve is from Geneva, and Matt is from the United States. I'm from California, Southern California. Matt's in Arizona. And we are just thrilled to be with Singing Dragon. So grateful that they are supporting the work of Steve and Matt and myself. And we're here tonight for the power of touch. And so far, we have people from all over the world, from the UK, United States, Australia, Canada, Ireland, Germany, Switzerland, Portugal, Belgium, Netherlands, Scotland, Spain, and more. So if you're just joining us, please feel free to write your name and where you're from. And if you are watching this for the recording, we welcome you also. If you couldn't be here live, it's nice to be in connection with you through this webinar. And I also wanted to tell you that we are using closed captioning today in an attempt to be more inclusive. So if you're not familiar with the closed captioning, basically at the very bottom toolbar, if you take your cursor down there, you should see something, a little box with CC on it that says live transcript. And if you press your cursor on that, you'll have the option to show your subtitle or hide your subtitles if they're a little bit distracting to you. Some people like to turn them off. You can also click view full transcript, which will put the transcript in the chat. So especially if you have any kind of hearing impairment, or the way that I speak doesn't actually work for your ear, or it's not loud enough, sometimes it's helpful to have those extra supports through the closed captioning. This event is being recorded, and a copy of it will be distributed to you in about 2 to 3 days. So if you have to leave early, or you're missing a little bit, or whatever comes up at your house, just know that you'll still have access to the recording. We have a digital goodie bag for you that is really amazing. The first thing in the digital goodie bag that you get for registering is 25% off 3 different books. The first one is Matt's new book that's just come out from Singing Dragon, called Integrative Rehabilitation Practice. And I've seen an early copy of it, and you are going to want to get this book. It is amazing. And then Steve also has several books. He has 4 books, some what we call graphic medicine books, educational comic books. And the books that he's produced and Singing Dragon has helped to distribute are Touch is Really Strange, Pain is Really Strange, Trauma is Really Strange, and Anxiety is Really Strange. So those books have been given the highest award by the British Medical Awards in 2016. And just so you know, all the links to those books are in the chat right now if you want to click on them or copy them into your Word doc. The other book that's 25% off is this wonderful book that just came out, and it's edited by Diane Finlayson and Lori Highland Robertson, and it's called Yoga Therapy, Foundational Tools and Practice. And I actually have chapter number 3 in this book called The Foundations of Yoga Therapy that I wrote. And so that book also is 25% off through the link that's being provided in the chat. In addition, in your digital goodie bag, you're going to have white papers from both Steve Haynes and Matt Erb, and the extract or the chapter that I wrote for the book, Yoga Therapy, Foundational Tools and Practice. So there's a lot of great stuff. Don't miss out on that. And so I think we should move into introducing our speakers this evening, depending on where you are. For some of you, it's middle of the day. So I think I'll start with Matt. Matt Erb is a physical therapist and associate clinical director for the Center for Mind-Body Medicine. He's also an instructor at the University of Arizona, Andrew Weil Center for Integrative Medicine. He's a guest lecturer for the departments of psychiatry and family medicine. Matt also has a clinical practice with the Simons Physiotherapy in Tucson, Arizona. And he is the founder of Embody Your Mind, which is focused on writing, teaching, and counseling. And again, Matt's new book is called Integrative Rehabilitation Practice. Steve Haynes is from Geneva, and he is a body worker, an author, and a trainer. He studied in yoga, shiatsu, craniosacral therapy, trauma release exercises, which are called TRE. And in the UK, he's registered as a chiropractor. As we stated earlier, he's the best-selling author of 4 graphic medicine books, educational comic books, which have already won awards. So I would love to welcome Matt and Steve, and I'll just tell you a little bit about myself also. My name is Amy Wheeler, and I am the former president of the board for the International Association of Yoga Therapists. And I also am founder and director of a yoga therapy school that certifies yoga therapists at the 1,000 hour plus level. So my school is called Optimal State Yoga Therapy. All right, so welcome to Steve and Matt. Thank you for being here.
Very happy to be here, thank you.
Great, so happy
Hello,
to have
everyone.
you. All right, so we are having a discussion today, a really important discussion, one that has been kind of a hot topic in the fields of physical therapy, body work, yoga therapy for quite some time, and that's the power of touch. And I think before we get done with this discussion, we'll see that power of touch can be used in an appropriate way and in ways that support the healing, but used inappropriately, it can also cause harm and trauma. So one thing I want to kind of use to frame the discussion is that Steve is more in the body work world, although he has so many talents, as we talked about. Matt's in physiotherapy, I'm in yoga therapy. We all have maybe different language for the same concept. So we're going to do our best to limit the jargon and if we do use it, explain how our field defines that language. So I think we'll just start off with a question, and I'll have Steve go first. Steve, why are you so interested in this concept of touch as a healing modality? And specifically, you have said that we experience touch as a baby, and we experience sensation long before we can even speak or articulate our words. So why is that important to our discussion today?
Thank you. I'm going to start with a quote from Margaret Atwood, actually. So touch comes before sight, before speech. It is the first language and the last, and it always tells the truth. I really love that. So touch is one of the first things to develop. There's some evidence that we are responsive to touch after 8 weeks in utero. I think most of our early experiences are rooted in a world that touches us, and we push against the world and it pushes back. All our concepts of safety, what's too much, too quick, too fast, is embedded inside of us through the process of touch. We're shaped, literally shaped by the world. We're molded and formed by experiences. And all our early concepts of what is safe or what is too much are actually formed by engaging with the world without words. Words come much, much later, 3 years before we can have a timeline and a sense of a narrative that we can remember. But we've got huge defining experiences pushing our way through a birth canal, going from a warm, wet environment to meeting gravity, to being received by our caregivers, to feeding, to finding the weight of our limbs even. These things are determinative about what's safe and learning. And I think this is always available to us. There's a kind of a wordless knowing about being human. And good touch can really lever that wordless knowing, these early experiences, and help us reconnect to safety if that process was initially safe and welcoming and full of love and joy and ease and creativity. And also if our early experiences were a struggle and maybe some trauma processes, some sense that it wasn't safe and we were speeding up to survive or disappearing to survive, I really believe that safe touch in adults can help us rediscover something that was lost or didn't quite come into place. And we can re-find a sense of safety beyond contemplative words as a deep felt sense, a deep world of sensation inside of us.
You know, when you're saying that, it really helps me to understand as a yoga therapist why it is some people prefer to be adjusted or prefer not to be adjusted, or why consent is so important and giving people permission to say no, thank you. So
Yeah, there might be some very, very old patterns behind that. So some people in the birth canal, they struggle. We did it all on our own. It felt like, I came out fighting, and the pattern of me and my autonomy involves independent action. And some of us got exactly the right help. Maybe the way that our mother contracted, or maybe a pair of hands it came along at exactly the right moment. And that early priming around support and touch goes very, very deep and sets up all sorts of habits and needs and ways of relating later on in life.
that's so beautiful. Thank you, Steve, for articulating that so beautifully. And I think it leads right into what I'd like to ask Matt to begin is, Matt, you're quoted as saying, sensation is the bedrock of our being, the way we be in the world. And specifically with reference to neurodevelopment. So what did you mean by that? Sensation is the bedrock of our being.
Just getting myself unmuted here. Essentially the same thing that Steve has just said, that we sense the world first before the development of the cognitive sort of capacity, the language realm even. As I was listening to Steve talk, I was trying to remember where I read this, and I probably won't, but I was reading about heart rate variability, which has to do with the vagus nerve. And that respiratory sinus arrhythmia, which is where there's a really naturally synchronized speeding up and slowing down of the heart when we inhale and exhale, begins to disappear as a natural state somewhere between 5, 6, 7 years old. And that parallels the onset of education, thinking realm, cognitive development, learning. And I don't remember who it was that wrote that, and I want to be careful. I really like to stick to the science, to solid science. But I found that fascinating to contemplate how it is that when we transition to thinking our way through the world as opposed to feeling our way, sensing our way through the world, and that oftentimes in my own work, we're bringing that back into balance. Helping people see where they're trying to rely on a purely cognitive strategy to navigate the world and have lost touch with this bedrock, this capacity to sense. The other quote I'll throw out real quick, and also gonna not remember, this is from a yogi. I think it's possibly in the book, The Science of Breath. So we'll have to look that up. He says, sensation is the connecting point between the mind and body, where one can know what is right for the whole being. And the only thing I would add to that is that it's a connecting point between body, mind, and environment, because each of us, our body and mind, is interacting with environments, and that carries profound influence on what we experience, including our sensory experience. And so it's really beginning to explore that.
Matt, it's reminded me of something that both you and I care deeply about, and that is Indigenous cultures. And it seems to me that there is an embodied wisdom and appreciation of that embodied wisdom with your environment, with yourself, with your loved ones, that's very different than just walking through the world as a talking head or a thinking head. and kind of feeling disconnected from the neck down. Yet society is so much rewarding us for just thinking our way through. Do you have anything you want to add to that?
Just the validation and acknowledgement of indigenous wisdom. There's a man in southern Ontario. He was a former judge, and I'm terrible with names. I really apologize. I should have these more ready at hand, but wrote a book about his experience working in tribal communities in southern Ontario, and the difference between indigenous mind and what he calls colonial mind, and that indigenous way of being so aware of the continuous interplay of our experience with nature, ecology. You know, one of my favorite phrases is ecosystems within ecosystems. And all of that really is the way that we can discover that is by coming into a deeper, more conscious relationship with our sensing capacity. And the work that I've been gifted to do, I'm calling in here from giving my own land acknowledgement. I think I saw someone acknowledge that in their introductions, but I'm on Tohono O'odham and Pasquayaki land here in Arizona, the ancestral lands of these people. And it's important to acknowledge that. But all that I've learned in my work on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation is consistent with that, what you've just expressed and what we're talking about here. And none of this is new.
Right.
That's what I'll say.
Steve, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I love the idea that we're a body is much more than a thing. A body is a process. And David Abraham, who wrote The Spell of the Sensuous, we are an open circuit that completes ourselves by engaging with the world. And if we just remove the external, if we remove the environment, we miss out on so much. And it's a real error because you don't stop at the flesh. You are always a process that's deeply contextual and deeply shaped by what's around you. And yeah, always really good to know that. Very hard to act out. I love the phrase, I'm a thinking head walking around. But we're a sensing body engaged in a world, and we are only complete in the act of engaging with the world.
I could not agree more, Steve. And I think what's happened to a lot of us is that through trauma, through life experience, we have kind of shut down that interoceptive awareness of feeling and being and sensing in the world. So, Steve, how do you define interoception as a concept? And can you tie that to this idea of being able to self-regulate internally so that you can interact with your environment in a way that supports you and your nervous system?
I can try. So I think for many of us, we operate off a reduced sense of who we are. So feeling is hard, and it's a big mess of information streaming through us. And frequently there's pain or emotions that are churning, and we just limit our bandwidth because it's too much quite often. So a kind of technical term for that is dissociation. We lose contact with who we are. It's a well-known term in trauma. So the idea that dissociation is an act of conscious withdrawal. But I'm going to offer that dissociation always involves an inability to relate to our body, an inability to feel the slow background tone of the body. So we have lots of ways of feeling and sensing our body, but there's a whole set of slow information. It's called the slow background tone of the body. Some of it coming from slow C fibers in fascia, lots of it coming from your organs, your blood vessels. It's the slow signals that seem to be really important in consciousness that form our homeostasis. Snapshot, this is your body right now. And when you have a constant stream of these interoceptive moments, you have a stream of coherence in your sense of consciousness, sense of who you are. It's coherent. I know what I feel and I know who I am is founded on this slow background tone of the body. That's very, very exciting science. But this stuff gets knocked out by traumatic experiences and by the act of protecting ourselves, by making ourselves small and withdrawing. We have lots of chemicals that mask signals that can be dangerous. And one of the things they mask particularly is those slow background tone of the body, the size, the shape, the weight, the flow. All those things fade into the background. They become blank and hard and numb. So our first journey really in connecting is this journey of waking up the internal sense of our body. And when we feel safe inside of our body, when we have the ability to not be fragmented and disconnected from our body, and then I think selfhood is rooted in this ability to feel the slow background tone of our body. And when we're safe inside of us, we're safe to reach out and we start doing good things because we feel good inside of ourselves and we're more open and available and we can relate to people. And then that spreads as a sort of spiritual act, really, that I include more in my sense of health. I can pay attention to nature and spirit and mystery. I'm excited by difference because I feel safe inside of myself and I can explore from the safe home of my body. So interoception, the ability to feel this slow, safe sense of self, really allows us to have a secure base to move out and explore the world and ultimately be more generous in our interactions and more able to see others' viewpoints and have a larger framework.
And we've talked before, but it seems to me that you have even gone as far as to say that when we don't have that interoception and that ability to self-regulate internally, that it becomes very difficult to go out into the world and negotiate the world and the people in it.
Yeah, a kind of reality, the whole business of knowing is really hard. If you don't know your body, what can you know? It's often just ideas floating around in a big old brain that can, get really lost. We need the ground of the body and the ability to interact. I found a nice quote when I was writing Touch is Really Strange, that the sense we rely on for reality most is touch. And there's this sort of, we touch the world touches us, and it reinforces our sense of reality. So yeah, this mutual becoming by feeling ourselves allows us to feel the world, and the world touches us back and we feel more real and we get this virtuous circle. We just lose all of that if we disconnect from our body and don't get touched and disconnect from others.
That's fascinating because the International Association of Yoga Therapists, when I was president a couple of years ago, we looked at all the other healthcare fields like physiotherapy and body workers, and we saw that everyone had a touch policy and a way to guide people in how to get consent, how to touch appropriately, what you can't do, and that yoga therapy was lacking that in our scope of practice. So I would love to just share for a moment what IAYT came up with, because I think it's important. And I even asked my clients to sign this document right here, and I'll read it to you. But to upfront, when we are, offering our whatever modality we're offering, to allow people the opportunity to give consent or not, and to educate them a little bit about touch. So here's the consent form that I use, and the one that IAYT now recommends all of their CIAYTs create and have people sign. Touch is a powerful tool in teaching and in healing and transformation. It is integral to many approaches to yoga therapy as an effective and useful nonverbal way to assess, instruct, share information nonverbally, and increase awareness. People's experience with touch and feelings about touch are varied and informed by their cultural and societal orientation. Yoga therapy principles, methods, and practices, including language, movement, position, gesture, and touch, and when used respectfully and responsibly, are all essential attributes of the yoga therapy process. When used skillfully, with clear boundaries, sensitive application, and good clinical judgment, touch has a legitimate and valuable role as a body-oriented mode of engagement. And then we have them print their name and sign it. So I just wanted to share that because that's a big development in the field of yoga therapy, but I think it goes straight to the heart of what Steve was talking about in terms of interoception and self-regulation. If yoga therapy specifically is looking to help people learn how to self-regulate so they can negotiate the environment and the external world, it seems that would be a big part of helping them learn that self-regulation through the interoceptive experience. I also want to invite all of our attendees to write questions in the Q&A. You can do it anonymously or you can do it with your name on it, but I'm sure both Matt and Steve would really love to have some questions from the audience. So anytime, just pop them in there and I will read them as we see them come up. So Matt, I want to ask you a question now that is along the lines of what Steve was just talking about with interoception. Could you tell us how touch differs for different people? Like the same touch could be experienced differently, and maybe give us some examples of this intra-individual approach to touch.
Sure. Before I jump into that, two important thoughts came to mind to emphasize from what Steve was sharing. And the first is when I'm sometimes training people in interoceptive awareness, inadvertently people get the message that somehow they're supposed to be tuned in to that 24/7. And so the message that that's not realistic, nor is it necessarily healthy or appropriate to be monitoring 100% of that information all the time. So what I'm saying is dissociation in stages and grades outside of what might be considered a problematic state, which can come with trauma states, mental health states, is actually normal on a spectrum for all of us. The question is, when do we tune in and act? We say drop anchor, which is the cue to check in with what is going on in the body right now. So I just wanted to emphasize that. And then the other will speak to this question, and it's the idea of safety and what determines safety. What does safety even mean? That's very different for each person. And the concept of safe enough, safe as relative, helps distinguish between things that may be unpleasant to us, new, unfamiliar, certain types of sensing, detecting sensations, as opposed to something that in the trauma world, the concept of window of tolerance and zone of arousal, that up to a certain point, we can tolerate stimulation, activation, and then at a certain point, it may actually be outside of our window of tolerance or zone of arousal, where it actually becomes problematic, where it sets up more defensive behavioral responses, the fight, flight, freeze sort of responses. And so helping people understand that and know, begin to identify and frame what that zone is for them and what is safe enough, that there may not necessarily be a 100% absolute sense of safety ever as humans, in a sense. Now, just adding one more thing to your question about what determines that, I let the person tell me what determines that, because I don't always know for sure what the balance of the interaction, the balance, the quality, whether the touch or the experience or the environment even is going to be experienced as friend or foe, pleasant or unpleasant, novel, which is like a healthy, ooh, what's that? Pay attention versus, versus normal, where we're more apt to habituate, tune out that sensory input. And so I try to set up a scenario where people are educating me through the provision of choice, and then sometimes through trial and error, so that what is it that determines that balance, that determines safety, is made clear in process as I interact with clients, with patients.
I love what you're saying, Matt, because it takes us all the way back to the neurodevelopment and the ability, as Steve was saying earlier, to articulate what it is that feels pleasant to us, unpleasant to us, too hard, too soft, too fast, too slow, and brings the language together with the touch as an adult in a way that maybe we couldn't as a young child. So we have a wonderful question from one of our attendees. They say, I recently started an education in physiotherapy. My teacher in medical massage has the opinion that medical massage has to hurt in order to be effective. I think either of you could answer this. Maybe we'll go to Steve first, but Steve, how would you respond to that?
Yeah, you don't need to give pain to change pain. So uh, the stimulus needs to be safe and meaningful for that person. So some people like the notion of a vigorous and intense sensation because it makes sense in their history and their life story. It's not inherently good or bad for the tissues. It's a different type of stimulus. And if there's a contract and an agreement and that type of touch is useful for the person who's receiving it because of their construct, then yes, it can be very useful to touch as a very particular type of stimulus. We have some receptors that only respond to deep vibrational or deep type of touch. But I work in a soft touch way. I think you take far less risks when you do slow, gentle touch. And if you realize touch is about meeting a whole person, then I'd like you to think about a tickle. If we tickle someone, every system in their every system in their body changes from this tiny, tiny stimulus. They'll have memories of early childhood experience, whether that was good or bad, but every muscle in their body will change. Every system in their body will change from this tiny stimulus. So if you understand that, then you realize it's not about the pressure. It's a much larger game we're playing when we're touched.
And Steve, I'm going to stay with you for a minute and then come back to Matt. You know, the trend in physiotherapy is now moving away from manual therapies to more passive therapies. I hope I got that right. And more towards a self-empowered care. So what would you say about that? That if we're withholding the passive therapies because we feel it's not self-empowered enough?
Yeah, passive therapy has come to mean in this context, as I understand it, things like the therapist, physical therapist, chiropractor, I trained as a chiropractor, is doing something to the client. And the client lies on the table, receives, can ultimately fall asleep maybe. And that, in terms of changing pain, that model hasn't really stood the test of time. It doesn't do particularly well. So if my goal is externally to poke, prod, stretch, twist, to open your joint and not a muscle, whatever that means, to align something, that doesn't really come out great in pain studies as a valid model. So there's been a huge move away in physiotherapy to education around how pain works, biopsychosocial model, a much more complex experience that involves emotion, meaning, context always. And then sort of more motivation about getting people moving and taking the fear around moving. So a lot of focus on exercise and how to help people to move safely in very creative ways, not just our classic grunt and move in a gym, but kind of developing new safe movement patterns as a way out of pain. So in those gestures to educate and move, they've taken away this notion of touching as a primary tool. Diagnostic touch doesn't work particularly well. Touch to change the tissues, it's very hard to say that that's what's actually happening on a local level. I like a lot of that, but I think there's a type of touch that's very different from the poking, prodding, stretching with the goal of just focusing on local dynamics. And I think you miss out on this notion of touch that meets a whole person, touch that can lever these early experiences of safety and help people reconnect to a sense of themselves. That touch is this tool that reinforces our sense of self Touch is always emotional, it's always complex, but that's something to be celebrated and included. It's, you always touch whole people, never a part of a person. So I'm worried that in the drive to focus on good things, education and movement, but strip away passive, I'm doing something to you type touch, we lose this other element of touch, what I call relational touch, sometimes called effective touch, touch that is always about complexity, but is always about inherently emotional and involves much earlier learning patterns, the one we tried to talk about earlier.
That is such a beautiful paradigm shift, right? And Matt, I know that you have an article that you've pointed out by David Nichols in the Journal of Orthopedic Sport Physical Therapy, JOSPT, that has something kind of interesting to say along these lines. Do you want to fill us in on that?
Yeah, Dr. Nichols is in New Zealand. He's one of the founders of the Critical Physiotherapy Network, which is really looking to examine very deeply some of the historical underpinnings of the profession. And in this editorial, he pointed out that passive therapies have always been a part of human experience and will likely always continue to be a part of human experience. And so this framework of sort of throwing out the idea of passive therapies altogether really doesn't make a lot of sense. And I'd encourage people to take a look at the full editorial if they can get access to it. It's very interesting framework, especially for my profession. And I agree with him that I often frame the idea of the core human needs of that safety, which we just talked about in the framework of contextual safety. And then nurturance and empowerment, which I like to see as the yin and yang, or the masculine and feminine, the sun and moon in yoga. Of the nurturance principle, the feminine principle is very much supported by that passive type experience, passive therapies, passive touch. And I think it's vital to meeting human needs. In some cases, in a safe setting that the person may not have ever experienced before when they encounter it. And then the empowerment piece comes in when that is balanced by keeping people very engaged and finding a greater sense of empowerment or capacity or autonomy, agency, and how to respond. The concept of aggressive touch, I just wanted to add one thing about that, or extreme massage. The way that I work with that is to help create the type of awareness that allows people to know whether the approach that's being used is it is dialing up the fight or flight, the sympathetic nervous system response. So I say, if you're noticing that your body tension is going up instead of down, or if you're holding your breath, or you're gritting your teeth, or your face is tensing up, the risk for that to be counter therapeutic is much greater. Now, I agree with Steve, there are some cases where that can be an effective, valuable approach. It's self-selected and useful, but I wanted to point out that that's how I work with it, because there was a question here about how do I in physiotherapy, and I'm just like Steve, I work with lighter touch. You could call it, some of these integrative or complementary touch-based therapies, I'm not so sure that the belief systems that people present them under necessarily can be fully validated, at least from the scientific model. But when it's looked at from the lens of what has happened, what am I communicating to the person? What's the balance of the relationship in which it's being delivered? So myofascial release, for example, or the craniosacral therapy. I don't necessarily present that as that I am sustainably changing fascial structure in the body, or that I'm necessarily changing cranial bone structure or CSF. That's not how I present it, because I think what it comes back to is sort of the sensory dermal neuromodulation. It's changing the autonomic central nervous system patterning, and it's creating a new experience of the body that the person may have never had. And that's where I think the real juice comes from.
Yeah, I love that. It takes us back to safety. So the idea that whatever your conceptual framework is, the change is happening for the mechanisms you articulated so clearly there, Matt. It's received as a safe stimulus, and then the body changes. The biggest predictor of stiffness in sort of objective measures, where you kind of measure how far people can bend, is that their sense of fear about the sensation is the thing that determines their ability to bend, rather than the actual tissue capability. So sometimes you can trick people and they'll bend really nicely because they're not thinking or experiencing or paying attention to the sensation. So when the fear is sort of tricked out somehow or factored out, people can bend this far. But when they're consciously paying attention to it and they're getting alarmed about the signal, that's the thing that determines the state of the body, the perceptual experience. Hugely interesting stuff.
And that right there, Steve, is why I've never tried Rolfing, because I sense that I am scared of it, and I'm not sure that it would be safe for me, right? So we have a question from Peter for, I guess, either of you, but mainly for Steve, I think. He says, in my experience, the power of touch becomes truly potent when the client is guided to tune in and meet my touch as much as I meet them. Their presence is really facilitating the depth of the work. Do you feel this should be made explicit at the onset of the session? In my experience, if I don't include some dialogue to guide the client to understand the relational touch, they can become overwhelmed with the sensations that come up for them. And this person works as a massage therapist. So what do you think?
Yeah, no, this often might come out, certainly in cranial sessions. Is it okay to fall asleep in a cranial session? Yes, if you're exhausted, please do fall asleep, have a rest on the table. Why you're paying me to touch you while you fall asleep, that's a different question. But I think for me, I really like my clients to stay awake. I really like my client to be consciously engaged in the process. And I think because the feeling business is so hard, it's my job to help make sure that what we're doing isn't too much for that person too soon. So very much it's a sort of education that we can feel more. I'm hoping that my safe, soft, warm hands, my presence in that process is facilitating an increase in your ability to feel. But I realize that it's a tool. And if we've come from a dissociative place, to be asked, what are you feeling, is often inherently scary and confusing and just doesn't make sense. And it's very anxiety provoking. So it's a real skill to lever in a stimulus that isn't too much for that person at any given time. But I do think it's a worthwhile goal. And I explicitly, over the course of sessions, I'm trying to prompt people to find words for feelings and to try and be with the sensation, not to drift away, not to fall asleep, though sometimes those things can be useful.
I love that. Thank you very much. We have so many great questions that we're not going to get to all of them today. I'd like to finish up with one for Matt. Matt, we know that some people have zero tissue damage, and yet touch is very painful to them. And we have other people who their structural MRIs or X-rays look like it would be horrible, and yet there's not a sensation of pain. So there's kind of a big discussion about, is pain a perception or a sensation? Is it made up in our heads, or is it real? Could you finish us off today and just talk a little bit about that?
Well, it's a rabbit hole, and I'll start with the title of Steve's book, Pain is Really Strange. There is several professionals. One is a rheumatologist, John Quintner, and I'm not thinking of the other person's name, but they talk about pain as an aporia, which means it's a mystery. There's aporia, A-P-O-R-I-A. It's an interesting framework. The way that I work with it, and acknowledging my own humility, and that there's a lot that we have yet to be discovered, but pain is first and foremost a sensation. It is something that is felt in the body. And so even though in cases where this this idea that I shouldn't address the part of the body, this hands off, shouldn't address the part of the body where the pain is felt under the assumption that there's nothing happening there, could potentially be flawed. For example, there's research into microinflammation that may be impacting nociceptive signals, nociceptive input from the body into the brain. I tend to take a very validating approach that pain is first and foremost a sensation. I do think once it arises into consciousness, there are perceptual influences. It's kind of like that friend or foe, pleasant or unpleasant, novel or normal. I like this, I don't like this. That balance can be explored consciously, and we can interact with it. I don't know how much of that determination of that categorization and that emotional piece that we've been talking about, the somato-emotional piece, that all sensory input is an informant to what we call feelings and emotions. And so it's rising up into our consciousness somewhere along the way. You can hear from my language the rabbit hole piece, because there's such a big topic here and it can go in many different directions. But that's how I would start with it. I don't know if Steve has something he would add to that.
Yeah, I kind of, it's always complex, and yeah, the rabbit hole, absolutely. But it's always real. So if someone tells you in pain, they're in pain. My pain is different from your pain. I can never truly understand your pain. So particularly as clinicians, there's old insurance industries that are trying to find out whether it's real pain or not, or people are faking their back pain, but for insurance purposes. But that's a very, very minor facet of the pain experience. If you're a clinician or if you're a human being and someone's there says in pain, they're in pain. And that might mean many things, might have all sorts of advantages sometimes. It has all sorts of meanings in their life. But start with this incredible validation that something's suffering here and someone's hurting. When I hear the word pain, I directly equate it to the word suffering. Differentiating the two out is actually very hard. Suffering may be a larger existential category of meaning, but really, if you start from the idea that minds and bodies are unified in the process of engaging with the world, then, and if you say that pain is about bodies and suffering is about minds, you're sort of in reinforcing that split. So yeah, it's tricky, really tricky. You get into quirky philosophy. For most of my clients, validate the experience and say it's never just about the tissues, it's always more complex. If you're getting divorced and your boss is giving you a hard time, you're more likely to be sensitive and it's more likely to hurt. Let's look at all the other things that might be making you sensitive, and that's all in the pot, probably contributing to your stress response and sense of not being able to cope with this horrible signal.
I completely agree. And I see Matt shaking his head. In yoga therapy, we say that the client's reality is the reality, that we meet them in that place where they are. And again, we can't separate out that divorce or that stress at work from the torn ACL or whatever it is that's going on in the tissues. It's all one. So we're going to have some time for a few more questions, and I see that they have come in. But before we get into about 10 minutes of questions, I just wanted to announce the next Singing Dragon event like this, which is going to be on September 30th. And the title is Showing Up Safe, what we've been talking about today. Cross-disciplinary conversations on emotional and ancestral trauma and healing from within. And those talks will be featuring Gail Parker, Lori DeChar, and Kevin Durgin. So there is a link in the chat if you'd like to book at an early bird rate to join us again on September 30th. All right, well, we have just a couple more questions here. I love this one, and whoever wants to answer it can take it. What if someone is in a dissociative state? Will they even notice light touch, or do you need to put more firm pressure for them to actually sense and feel? Anyone want to, how about you, Matt? What do you think?
Well, again, naming that dissociation comes in many forms, stages, and grades. I can give an example of my own years ago working actually on the same patio that this little frog picture you see up there on the wall. I took that in Minnesota. I suddenly saw blood everywhere. And I was like, what? And then suddenly I discovered I'd gashed my arm open. I had no conscious awareness that it had happened, but after I saw it, it hurt like heck. I didn't notice that I had actually cut my arm open. And so the attentional modulation might interact with various forms and stages of dissociation and where attention is focused to sort of gateway out of attention, various forms of touch. So that I'll let Steve pick up from there to see what he would add.
Yeah, I think the first step is don't make it a bad thing. So it's actually quite normal for most of us. I believe most of us dissociate most of the time, and that's okay. So I've had lots of conversations with people. I remember a woman, she had a PhD, she was a dancer, Pilates teacher, amazing. And, you know, it was a struggle, the interview, and struggles the early sessions. And I asked this question, where are you right now? And she kind of looked at me, says, I'm on the outside looking in. Says, well, how far are you away? So I didn't say, oh, that's bad. I said, how far are you away? She says, I'm on the building opposite, outside looking in. Oh, gosh, you don't feel very safe here, do you? No, I hate being touched. And, you know, it became the start of a long conversation and a long therapeutic process that hopefully, well, she reported some real benefits in knees and pains and backs. But the sense was we normalized her experience of being outside of it. It became a negotiation. Do you notice when you do that, how far away do you go? Are you upside, you know, above looking in, or in front looking, in front of yourself looking in? So playing with the construct is a very nice thing, and sort of making it normal, and we can negotiate. So another way is, if people can't find an anchor into their body right now, then can they remember that? So was there a time, maybe walking in the woods last weekend, or a favorite holiday lying on a beach? And if they can't remember feeling connected to their body, can they, you might be asked, can you have a fantasy or a dream or an ideal state, what that might be like? So hopefully in that conversation, you can find some threads of connection. What's it like when you do your favorite thing, playing the guitar, baking cakes? What's it like when you're breathing, or your muscle tone? Maybe you collect some peak experiences and you start weaving these in as there's a thread, there's something that you can remember about being in bodies that's not about pain, but has a sense of celebration. So yeah, lots of ways to negotiate that. You do have to be creative sometimes. But I do think it's a really worthwhile journey, and the payoff is enormous as people slowly make friends with their body and go beyond the painful, difficult, tough things. There's a real sense of, I don't know, finding joy, and this sense that the body just kicks into gear and starts healing and reorganizing things because the consciousness is rooted in the body.
Well, I think you just answered one of the other questions, which was, what are some approaches or some advice for therapeutic work, and how we can make people more aware and comfortable of connecting with their own sensations? And I think you just kind of answered that one. So let's take our last question of the day, and I'll start with Matt and then go back to Steve. It says, I'm curious to know what you might speak to when light touch is actually more dysregulating or disorienting than a more grounded, firm, kind of earthed touch. What do you think of that, Matt?
Yeah, I think it comes back to setting up a forum of choice and feedback-informed care. To determine that. The occupational therapist, Peggy Nenow, who is a certified somatic experiencing practitioner, SEP, Peter Levine's work, who contributed the sensation, exploring sensation chapter in our textbook, did talk about that and how important it is to be aware of that as a potential and to work with people to determine what the right amount of pressure or force is for their comfort level. And I think feedback is where that's at. and your attunement too. We can't always rely on accurate feedback, because sometimes people will be experiencing something and that safe enough scenario isn't set up, so it's hard for them to give you feedback. So you have to tune to your own capacity to sense what's going on with that person.
Yeah, very nicely put. I think some people heal in space, some people heal in containment, and some people heal in different ways on different days. So it's a constant dance and a constant negotiation, as Matt described.
Beautiful. Well, I think that is a fantastic note for us to end on. And I just want to say thank you to both Steve and Matt, and highly recommend both of their books. Steve has 4 books. Touch is really strange, pain is really strange, trauma is really strange, and anxiety is really strange. And again, these are graphic medicine kind of educational comic books. And then Matt has just come out with the integrative rehabilitation practice. And I want to thank both of you for your time contributing to the field, the fields that you're in and that we're all in together. And also just note that, Matt, people would love to see the reference for that article from, let me find
David Nichols.
Yeah, the David Nichols article. So maybe we can put that out with the email with the recording, if that's okay.
Yes, I saw that they already acknowledged that it'll be sent, but I just posted the DOI in there too, so if people want to try to look for it sooner.
Perfect, thank you.
I did also want to acknowledge our book. It's co-edited. I had a co-editor, Arlene Schmid, who's a professor of OT who studies yoga therapy at Colorado State. And we did have multiple contributors: yoga therapists, PTs, OTs, art therapists, music therapists. So broad range of professions contributed to our book. I want to acknowledge them all.
It's a fantastic book. I got a pre-copy. A huge amount of work must have gone into that, Matt. I've huge respect. I've dipped in a few times and found a bunch of stuff that was interesting. Great stuff.
And Steve, could you just show us one of your books? You held it up before, and I thought it looked so amazing.
So there you go. There's Matt's. It's a beast. This really big old beautiful beast. Please look at it. I go a bit quicker and with pictures because I'm very simple. But there you go. Touch is really strange.
Love it, love it, love it. And thank you to Singing Dragon. I'm sure from Matt and Steve and myself, we're so appreciative of you putting on this webinar for us. And we hope to see you again soon. Have a great day. Thanks,
Amy.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.